The offering came at 12:15. A small, crumpled brown paper bag was placed on the park bench, inches away from a hand that had signed death warrants and commanded a criminal empire. Don Raphael Morty, a man who survived 3 assassination attempts and built a city on fear, looked down. He was expecting a briefcase full of laundered cash or a folder of leaked secrets, not a sandwich. "You look like you're hurting," a small voice whispered. Raphael's jaw tightened. He looked up to see Sophia, a 7-year-old girl with messy pigtails and a school uniform so faded it had almost lost its color. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't begging for mercy. She was giving away the only thing she had left to a man who already owned everything. His bodyguards froze, their hands hovering over their holsters, waiting for him to snap. But Raphael didn't move. He stared at the bag, the scent of cheap bread and peanut butter hitting him like a physical blow. It was a smell he hadn't known in 30 years, yet it felt like it had been waiting for him in the shadows of his soul. "I'm not hungry today," she lied, her eyes wide with a quiet, terrifying bravery. In that moment, the iron walls around Raphael's heart didn't just crack, they shattered. He realized that while he controlled the streets, he was letting the children who walked them starve. He didn't take the lunch, he didn't say thank you, he simply stood up and signaled to his men. "Find out where she goes to school," he commanded, his voice like grinding stone. "And find out who owns the deed to the building." As his black SUV tore away from the park, Raphael knew that by tomorrow, his reputation as a predator would be gone. He was about to start a war, not for territory, but for the future of a girl who thought a monster needed a meal. Stick around until the very end, because the secret Don Raphael discovered when he walked into that principal's office the next morning will change how you see the world forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe and comment below. What would you do if you were in Raphael's shoes? Now let's dive in. The air in Don Raphael Morty's office didn't circulate, it weighed. It was a room designed to make men feel small, a cathedral of dark mahogany, cold marble, and the sharp, acidic scent of expensive espresso and even more expensive tobacco. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city of Oakhaven stretched out like a sprawling gray beast, its heartbeat dictated by the rhythms of the man sitting behind the desk. To the world, Raphael was a ghost, a name whispered in the back of dive bars and the gilded halls of City Hall. To his enemies, he was a predator. To himself, he was simply the architect of a necessary order. He sat motionless, the high back of his leather chair framing him like a throne. At 52, Raphael carried the history of 1,000 hard decisions in the lines of his face. His hair, dark and slicked back without a single strand out of place, caught the dim light of the desk lamp. His suit was a masterpiece of Italian tailoring, charcoal wool that seemed to absorb the light around him, making him look less like a man and more like a shadow given form. On his right hand, a heavy gold signet ring rested against the polished wood of the desk, a symbol of a lineage built on blood and sustained by absolute, unwavering discipline. The morning had started as every morning did, with the ledger of life and death. His consigliere, a thin, hawk-faced man named Lorenzo, stood at the edge of the rug, reciting the day's inconveniences. There was a shipment of textiles held up at the docks by a union leader who had suddenly found his conscience. There was a rival family in the North End whispering about territory lines. There was a politician whose gambling debts had finally outpaced his usefulness. Raphael listened in a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. He didn't interrupt. He didn't fidget. He simply absorbed the data, his mind a cold machine calculating the most efficient way to maintain the equilibrium of fear. "The union leader," Raphael said finally, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried across the room. "Does he have a family?" "2 daughters, Don Raphael. One is starting university in the fall," Lorenzo replied, his voice devoid of emotion. Raphael adjusted the gold watch on his wrist, the metal cool against his skin. Remind him that education is a privilege, one that can be revoked. I don't want him broken, Lorenzo. I want him grateful that I allowed him to remain whole. This was the dominance Raphael practiced. It wasn't always about the spray of lead or the weight of concrete. It was about the psychological tether. He moved through his life with the absolute certainty of a man who knew exactly where every thread was pulled. He was the king of shadows, and in his kingdom there were no accidents. Every handshake was a contract, every glance was a warning, and every moment of silence was a test of loyalty. His daily routine was a choreographed display of power. When he left his estate, he didn't just walk to a car. He moved within a phalanx of silent, stone-faced men who viewed the world through the lens of potential threats. The black SUVs that carried them were mobile fortresses, tinted windows hiding the monster from the gaze of the people he technically protected. As the motorcade wound through the streets of Oakhaven, Raphael watched the city through the glass. He saw the graffiti-stained walls of the tenements, the flickering neon of the corner stores, and the weary faces of the working class. He felt a detached sense of ownership over it all. They were his subjects, whether they knew it or not. By noon, the weight of his empire felt particularly heavy. He had spent 3 hours in a basement meeting with the heads of the local distribution hubs, settling disputes over percentages with the cold finality of a judge. He had looked into the eyes of men who wanted him dead and watched them blink first. It was a performance he had given for 25 years, a mask of iron that never slipped. But beneath the charcoal wool and the gold rings, there was a hollow space, a persistent, gnawing numbness that no amount of wealth could fill. He decided he wanted to be outside. He needed air that didn't smell like ink and fear. He signaled to his lead driver, a mountain of a man named Marco. "The park," Raphael commanded. "The one on 4th and Lex. I'll take my lunch there." Marco hesitated for a fraction of a second. The park was an open space, a tactical nightmare, but one look from Raphael quelled the protest. They arrived 10 minutes later. The park was a patch of dying green amidst the concrete, a place where the sun struggled to reach the cracked pavement through the canopy of thirsty oaks. Raphael sat on a weathered wooden bench, his back straight, his eyes scanning the perimeter by habit. His bodyguards faded into the background, leaning against trees and trash cans, their eyes hidden behind dark glasses, their jackets unbuttoned for easy access to their sidearms. Raphael waited. He was supposed to meet a courier here, a man carrying the keys to a digital vault that would further solidify his grip on the city's shipping lanes. He checked his watch. 12:12 p.m. The sun was high, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the world. To anyone passing by, he looked like a wealthy businessman enjoying a moment of quiet. But the air around him was different. It was still, as if the birds and the wind were afraid to disturb the gravity of his presence. He felt the eyes on him before he saw the source. It wasn't the sharp, predatory gaze of an assassin, nor the flickering, nervous look of a snitch. It was something different, something soft and curious. He shifted his gaze slightly to the left. Standing a few feet away was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 7. She was small, her frame delicate, dressed in a school uniform that had seen far better days. The pleats in her skirt were uneven, and the white of her polo shirt had turned a dull, laundry-beaten gray. Her hair, a light, messy brown, was tied into pigtails that were beginning to unravel. She held a crumpled brown paper bag in both hands, clutching it to her chest as if it were a treasure. Raphael didn't move. He didn't smile. He looked at her with the same cold, analytical intensity he used on his rivals. He expected her to run. Most people did when they caught his eye. They saw the darkness in him, the history of violence that radiated off him like heat from a pavement. But the girl didn't flinch. She took a step forward, then another, her small shoes clicking softly on the asphalt. She stopped just in front of him. The contrast was absurd. A man who could buy and sell the city, draped in luxury and protected by steel, and a child who looked like she hadn't seen a new pair of shoes in 3 years. The silence between them stretched. Thick and heavy, Raphael's bodyguards began to close in, their movements subtle but lethal. Raphael raised a single finger, a silent command for them to hold. He looked at the girl's face. Her eyes were wide and expressive, filled with a mixture of nervous hope and a quiet, unearned bravery. She looked at his expensive suit, his polished shoes, and finally his face. She didn't see the Mafia boss. She didn't see the King of Shadows. She saw something else, something Raphael had spent 3 decades trying to kill within himself. She extended her arms, offering the crumpled bag. It was stained with a small spot of grease, the edges worn from her tight grip. "You look like you're hurting," she said. Her voice was thin but steady, carrying a weight of empathy that felt entirely foreign in this park. Raphael felt a strange sensation in his chest, a sudden, sharp constriction. He looked at the bag, then back at her. "I don't need your food, child," he said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "I know," she replied, her lips relaxing into a tiny, sad smile. "But I think you're hungrier than I am, not in your belly, in here." She tapped her own chest, right over her heart. The world seemed to stop. The sounds of the city, the sirens, the honking horns, the distant shout of a vendor, all faded into a dull hum. Raphael stared at the bag. He could smell it now, the faint, unmistakable scent of a peanut butter sandwich and a bruised apple. It was the smell of his childhood. It was the smell of the tiny apartment in the slums where he and his sister had huddled together under a single blanket, sharing a single piece of bread, because their mother had gone to work without eating so they wouldn't have to. He remembered the shame of that hunger. He remembered the vow he had made as a boy, standing over his sister's sickbed, promising that he would become so powerful, so rich, that no one would ever be able to take anything from him again. He had kept that promise. He had built a fortress of gold and bone. He was the most powerful man in Oakhaven. And yet, as he looked at this little girl offering him her meager lunch, he realized with a terrifying clarity that he was starving. He was a king sitting on a throne of shadows, ruling over a kingdom of ghosts, and he had forgotten what it felt like to be human. The hand wearing the $50,000 watch trembled just for a second. His fingers curled, hovering inches from the paper bag. He wanted to take it. He wanted to tear it open and find the boy he used to be. But the habits of a lifetime were too strong. He couldn't accept a gift he hadn't bought. He couldn't allow a crack in the armor. "Go home," Raphael whispered, his jaw so tight it ached. "Take your bag and go home." Sophia didn't argue. She lowered her arms, but she didn't look defeated. She looked at him with a profound, lingering pity that cut deeper than any blade. She turned and walked away, her small backpack bouncing against her shoulders, leaving the scent of the sandwich and the memory of innocence hanging in the air. Raphael sat in the silence long after she was gone. The courier arrived, the deal was struck, and the keys to the vault were placed in his hand. But for the first time in his life, the victory felt like ashes. He stood up, his movements heavy. "Marco," he called out. The bodyguard appeared instantly at his side. "Yes, boss." Raphael looked toward the exit of the park where the girl had disappeared. The blue-gray shadows of the afternoon were stretching out, claiming the world once again. "Follow her. Find out where she lives. Find out her name. And find out where she goes to school." "You want her handled, Don Raphael?" Marco asked, his hand moving toward his jacket. Raphael turned to him, his eyes burning with a sudden, ferocious light that made even the hardened soldier flinch. "No," Raphael said, his voice a low, dangerous snarl. "I want her protected, and I want to know who is responsible for the fact that she has to give her lunch away to a monster like me." As he walked back to the car, the King of Shadows felt the first stirrings of a different kind of power. He was still a predator, but the target had changed. He wasn't going to destroy a rival or bribe a judge. He was going to use his empire to wage a war against the very poverty that had created him. The little girl had given him a sandwich, and in return, Don Raphael Morty was going to give her a world where she never had to be brave again. The heavy, humid air of the afternoon hung over the city like a wet wool blanket, trapping the grit and the tension of Oakhaven within its folds. Don Raphael Morty sat on the weathered park bench, his posture a study in calculated stillness. To any passerby, he was merely a man of means enjoying a moment of respite, but beneath the charcoal fabric of his suit, every nerve was pulled taut like a piano wire. This was not a moment for peace. It was a moment for an execution. Raphael was waiting for a ghost, a man named Vincent the Vulture Gallo, a high-ranking lieutenant who had grown too comfortable with the idea of a coup. The park, with its open lines of sight and crumbling stone paths, was supposed to be the neutral ground where Vincent would deliver the final confirmation of his betrayal. Raphael's men were positioned like chess pieces in the periphery, Marco behind a thick oak tree, Enzo near the rusted swing set, and two others in a nondescript sedan idling at the curb. The trap was set, the air was thick with the scent of impending violence, and Raphael's hand rested near the weight of the silver-plated pistol tucked into his waistband. The silence of the park was deceptive. It was the silence of a held breath. Raphael checked his watch, a gold-rimmed masterpiece that marked the seconds with clinical precision. It was 12:08. Vincent was late, which was a message in itself. In Raphael's world, punctuality was a form of fealty, and every minute of delay was a drop of blood in the water. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrow and sharp, looking for the telltale gait of a man who knew he was walking toward his own end. He expected a black car, the heavy tread of leather boots, or perhaps the sudden, sharp crack of a distant rifle. He was prepared for war. He had spent his entire life mastering the language of the bullet and the blade, and he was ready to speak it once more. But the world did not offer him a traitor. Instead, it offered a small, flickering shadow on the edge of his vision. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light or a distraction sent by Vincent to draw his eye. He didn't turn his head, keeping his gaze fixed on the park entrance, but his peripheral vision caught the movement. It was small, rhythmic, and entirely lacking in the tactical grace of a professional. A young girl, no older than 7, was wandering toward him. She wasn't running, and she wasn't hiding. She was walking with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who was carrying something precious. Raphael felt a surge of irritation. A child in the kill zone was a complication he didn't need. He signaled subtly to Marco to intercept her, but before the massive bodyguard could move, the girl had already crossed the invisible line into Raphael's immediate space. She stopped 3 feet from the bench. She was a tiny fragment of humanity against the backdrop of the city's decay. Her light brown hair was pulled into pigtails that had survived a long morning of school, but were now fraying at the ends, soft wisps of hair framing a face that was still round with the remnants of babyhood. Her school uniform was a map of struggle. The fabric was thin and faded from too many washings, the hem of her skirt was slightly unraveled, and her shoes were scuffed white at the toes. She looked like the very thing Raphael had spent decades trying to forget, the face of the unremembered poor. In her hands she clutched a crumpled brown paper bag. It was damp at the bottom, perhaps from a cold drink or a piece of fruit, and she held it with a reverence that seemed entirely out of place in the presence of a man who dealt in millions. Raphael looked at her, his expression a mask of cold stone. He wanted to scream at her to leave, to tell her that death was sitting on this bench and it didn't have time for children. But something about the way she stood, her shoulders slightly raised in a show of quiet bravery, halted his tongue. She wasn't looking at his bodyguards. She wasn't looking at the gold on his wrists. She was looking directly into his eyes, searching for something he was certain he no longer possessed. "I saw you from the street," she said. Her voice was a soft, melodic contrast to the low rumble of the city traffic. "You've been sitting here a long time. You look like you're hurting." The words hit Raphael with the force of a physical blow. It was an observation so simple and so devastatingly accurate that it bypassed all his defenses. He didn't look like he was hurting. He looked like a king. He looked like power incarnate. But this child, with the intuition that only the innocent possess, saw through the charcoal suit and the slick-back hair to the hollowed-out man beneath. Raphael felt a flicker of the old shame, the ghost of the boy he had been before he learned that kindness was a weakness that got you killed. "I am waiting for business, child," Raphael replied, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "You shouldn't be here, it isn't safe." The girl didn't flinch. If anything, she stepped closer, her small frame casting a tiny shadow over his polished shoes. "My name is Sophia," she said, as if introducing herself was a shield. "And I know what it's like to wait for something that doesn't come. My mama waits for the bus that's always late. My teacher waits for the heat to turn on in the classroom. Waiting makes you hungry, not just in your tummy but in your spirit." She extended her arms then, offering the paper bag. The gesture was so pure, so utterly devoid of the transactional nature of Raphael's life, that he found himself momentarily paralyzed. In his world, a gift was always a debt. If someone gave you something, they wanted your loyalty, your silence, or your life. But Sophia wanted nothing. She was offering her lunch, the only thing she likely had to sustain her through the day, to a stranger who looked like he had the world at his feet. "I'm not hungry today," she lied, and Raphael knew it was a lie because he could see the way her eyes lingered on the bag for a split second before she pushed it toward him. "You take it. It's ham and cheese. The cheese is the good kind, the yellow kind." Raphael stared at the bag. The grease spot on the bottom seemed to grow, a small, dark stain on the purity of the moment. He thought of Vincent Gallo. He thought of the briefcase of money that was supposed to be here. He thought of the blood that was supposed to be spilled on this very pavement. And then he looked at the small, calloused hand of the girl. He noticed the backpack straps digging into her thin shoulders, suggesting a weight of books and a weight of life that she was too young to carry. The good kind of cheese. The phrase echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the days when a slice of processed American cheese was the height of luxury in the Morty household. "Why are you doing this?" Raphael whispered. The question wasn't for her, it was for the universe. It was a plea for understanding in a world that had ceased to make sense. "Because everyone deserves to have someone look out for them," Sophia said simply. She placed the bag on the bench next to him, her fingers brushing the mahogany wood for a fleeting second. "Even the men who sit in the dark." She turned then, not waiting for a thank you, not waiting for him to open it. She walked away with the same quiet dignity she had arrived with, her pigtails swaying with every step. Raphael watched her go, his eyes tracking her until she reached the park gates and disappeared into the flow of the city. He remained on the bench, the paper bag sitting beside him like a ticking bomb. Moments later, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened and Vincent Gallo stepped out, his face a mask of false contrition and hidden malice. He walked toward the bench, his eyes scanning the area, noticing the tension in Raphael's men but missing the small, crumpled bag on the seat. Vincent stopped a few feet away, spreading his arms in a gesture of feigned brotherhood. "Don Raphael," Vincent said, his voice oily and thick. "My apologies for the delay. The docks were a mess. I have the information you requested. Everything is in order." Raphael didn't look at him. He didn't look at the man who was planning to kill him, nor did he reach for the weapon at his waist. He reached instead for the paper bag. He picked it up, feeling the slight warmth of the bread through the paper. He opened it slowly, the crinkle of the bag sounding like a thunderclap in the quiet park. Inside was a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a small, slightly bruised red apple. "Don Raphael," Vincent prompted, his brow furrowing, "is there a problem?" Raphael finally looked up. His eyes weren't filled with the cold fire of a mob boss. They were filled with a terrifying, crystalline clarity. He looked at Vincent, a man who had everything and still wanted more, and then he looked at the path where Sophia had walked. "The problem, Vincent," Raphael said, his voice steady and cold as a winter grave, "is that I have spent my life building walls to keep the world out, only to find that I've trapped myself in a tomb. And while I was counting my gold, Children were giving away their last meal to keep me from starving. He stood up, clutching the bag to his chest as if it were more valuable than all the secrets Vincent could ever offer. He signaled to Marco and Enzo, who stepped out from the shadows, their expressions reflecting the confusion of the moment. "The meeting is over," Raphael announced. "But the business," Vincent started, his hand moving toward his own pocket. "The business is dead," Raphael cut him off. "And if you ever set foot in this park again, you'll join it. Marco, get the car. We have a school to find." As Raphael walked away from the trader and toward the awaiting SUV, he didn't feel the weight of his empire anymore. He felt the weight of the apple in the bag. He felt the sting of a 7-year-old's mercy. He was the king of shadows, but for the first time in 30 years, he was walking toward the light, and God helped anyone who tried to stand in his way. The black SUV felt like a tomb of leather and silence as it glided through the jagged streets of Oakhaven's South District. Don Raphael Morty sat in the back, the crumpled brown paper bag still resting on his lap. He hadn't eaten the sandwich. He hadn't even unwrapped the wax paper. To do so felt like an act of desecration, a consumption of a sacrifice he wasn't yet worthy of. His eyes were fixed on the window, watching the landscape shift from the glass and steel towers of the financial district to the skeletal remains of the industrial ward. Here, the buildings didn't reach for the sky. They slumped toward the earth, burdened by decades of neglect and the weight of 1,000 broken promises. "We're 3 blocks away from the address, Don Raphael," Marco said from the driver's seat. His voice was hushed, sensing the volatile storm brewing in the man behind him. "St. Jude's Elementary. It's a parochial school, but the diocese pulled funding years ago. It's mostly run on grit and prayer now." Raphael didn't respond. He was staring at a group of men gathered on a street corner, their faces etched with the same hollow exhaustion he had seen in his own father. He realized with a jolt of visceral discomfort that he owned the debt on the very building they were leaning against. He was the landlord of their misery. He had spent his life thinking he was protecting these neighborhoods by maintaining order, but he had merely been a different kind of blight, a predator who kept other predators away so he could harvest the remains in peace. The car slowed as they approached the school. St. Jude was a red brick fortress that had lost its luster. The iron gates were rusted shut in places, and the playground was a patch of cracked asphalt with a single, lonely slide that looked more like a jagged tooth than a piece of equipment. On the brick facade, a large banner hung limply, the wind tearing at its corners. "Save Our School, Final Enrollment Period." Beneath it, a smaller hand-painted sign bore the word that had driven Raphael to this place: closing. "Park here," Raphael commanded. He stepped out of the vehicle, the heat of the pavement rising to meet him. His expensive Italian shoes felt out of place on the debris-strewn sidewalk. He adjusted his charcoal jacket, but the garment suddenly felt like a costume, a heavy, suffocating layer of pretension. He walked toward the gates, his bodyguards trailing at a respectful distance. As he entered the schoolyard, the bell rang, a shrill, metallic sound that signaled the end of the day. A flood of children poured out of the heavy wooden doors. They were a sea of faded uniforms and mismatched jackets, their energy a sharp contrast to the gray surroundings. Raphael stood near a rusted fence, his eyes searching the crowd. He wasn't looking for a threat. He was looking for pigtails. He found her near the back of the line. Sophia was walking with her head down, her small backpack looking heavier than it had in the park. She didn't have the same light in her eyes as she did when she had offered him her lunch. She looked tired. She stopped at a concrete planter where a few wilted weeds struggled for life and sat down, waiting. Raphael watched as a woman approached her, a teacher perhaps, given the stack of papers she carried. The woman placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder, her expression one of deep, weary affection. They spoke for a moment, and though Raphael couldn't hear the words, he saw the teacher shake her head sadly, gesturing toward the closing sign. Sophia reached into her backpack and pulled out the empty space where her lunch should have been. She said something, and the teacher reached into her own bag, pulling out a small granola bar and handing it to the girl. The gift of scarcity. The phrase echoed in Raphael's mind. Sophia hadn't given him her surplus, she had given him her survival. She had walked into a world of monsters and offered the only shield she had. Don Raphael, Enzo whispered, appearing at his elbow. I've talked to the clerk inside. The school's debt was bought by a holding company called Apex Realty 6 months ago. They're foreclosing on Monday. They want to turn the lot into a private distribution hub for the docks. Raphael felt a cold, familiar fire ignite in his veins. He knew Apex Realty. It was a shell company owned by a conglomerate he had a working relationship with. They were his associates. They were doing exactly what he would have done a week ago, identifying a weak asset, liquidating the heart of a community, and turning a profit on the ruins. Who is the lead officer at Apex? Raphael asked, his voice a low, terrifying hum. A man named Sterling, sir. He's a bottom liner. Doesn't care about the history, just the square footage. Raphael turned away from the school, his gaze lingering on Sophia one last time. She was carefully unwrapping the granola bar, sharing half of it with a smaller boy who sat next to her. The sight was a mirror held up to Raphael's soul, and he didn't like the reflection. He had millions in offshore accounts, warehouses full of untaxed goods, and enough political capital to tilt the city on its axis. And yet, this child was doing more for the future of Oakhaven, with a piece of processed grain, than he had done in 25 years of leadership. Get me Sterling, Raphael said, walking back toward the SUV with a predatory grace. And get my legal team on the phone, not the ones who handle the disappearances. I want the ones who handle acquisitions, the sharks, the ones who know how to bleed a company dry in an afternoon. What are we doing, boss? Marco asked as he held the door open. Raphael sat in the back, picking up the crumpled brown paper bag once more. He finally opened it, pulling out the sandwich Sophia had offered him. He took a bite. The bread was dry and the good kind of yellow cheese was lukewarm, but it was the most honest thing he had tasted in decades. It tasted like a promise. We're not going to let them close this school, Marco, Raphael said, his jaw set like granite. We're going to buy it, and then we're going to buy the company that tried to kill it. I want to see Sterling in my office by sunset. Tell him to bring a pen. He's about to make the most expensive mistake of his life. As the SUV sped away, leaving the crumbling red bricks of St. Jude's behind, Raphael didn't look like a mafia boss. He looked like a man who had finally found something worth fighting for that wasn't himself. The King of Shadows was gone. In his place was a man who understood that true power wasn't measured by what you could take, but by what you were willing to protect. The scent of the sandwich, yeast, salt, and the oily sweetness of peanut butter was a key that turned a lock Raphael had kept rusted shut for 30 years. As the SUV glided back toward the city's heart, the luxury of the interior seemed to dissolve. The soft leather became the rough, splintered floorboards of a tenement. The quiet hum of the engine became the rhythmic, hacking cough of his younger sister, Isabella. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 12 years old again, standing in a kitchen that smelled of damp plaster and despair. He remembered the exact weight of a paper bag much like the one Sophia had given him. It had been a Tuesday, the day his mother worked double shifts at the laundry, leaving him to divide a single loaf of bread between himself and his sister. He remembered the hollow ache in his stomach, a physical void that felt like it was swallowing him from the inside out. But more than the hunger, he remembered the shame. The shame of watching Isabella pretend she wasn't hungry so he could have the larger half. The shame of knowing that in a city of lights and excess, they were invisible. Don Raphael, we're approaching the bridge. Marco's voice pulled him back to the present, but the memory clung to him like smoke. Keep driving, Raphael murmured, his voice thick. I need a moment. He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who had taken whatever he wanted for 3 decades. He had thought that by accumulating power, he was curing that old hunger. He had thought that every warehouse he seized and every rival he crushed was a brick in a wall that would keep the poverty of his youth at bay forever. But as the scent of Sophia's gift filled the car, he realized he had been wrong. He hadn't cured the hunger. He had only fed the monster it created. He remembered the night the music died in his house. Isabella had been 9, her eyes bright with a fever the local clinic couldn't afford to treat. He had stood on a street corner, much like the ones he now owned, and begged a local boss for a loan to buy medicine. The man had laughed, tossing a handful of coins into the gutter and telling him that mercy is for the weak. Isabella had died 3 days later, her small hand clutching his, her last words a whisper of apology for being a burden. That was the night Raphael Morty had died, and the King of Shadows was born. He had realized then that the only way to survive a system that didn't care was to become the system itself. He had climbed the ladder of bodies and bribes until he reached the top, believing that he was winning. But Sophia had changed the math. She had looked at him, the very personification of the system that had crushed her school, and she hadn't seen a monster to be feared. She had seen a man who looked hurt. She had offered him the very thing he had once been willing to kill for, a simple act of shared survival. "Marco," Raphael said, his eyes snapping open. The sorrow was gone, replaced by a cold, surgical focus. "The file on St. Jude. I want to know who the largest donors were before the diocese cut them off." "Mostly local businesses, sir. Small shops that have since gone under. The only major name left on the ledger is a charity group that's a front for the city council's slush fund. They've been letting the school rot so they can sell the land to Apex for a kickback." Raphael felt a grim smile touch his lips. This was a language he understood. This was the world of shadows, where greed disguised itself as progress. They weren't just closing a school. They were harvesting the last bit of hope from a neighborhood that had nothing else left. They were doing to Sophia what the world had done to Isabella. "They think they're playing a game of real estate," Raphael whispered. "They don't realize they've walked into a war of the soul." The car pulled into the private garage of his estate. As he stepped out, he didn't head for the bar or the lounge. He went straight to his study, a room filled with maps of the city's power structures. He looked at the South District, seeing not territory but faces. He saw the teacher with the weary eyes. He saw the boy sharing a granola bar. And he saw Sophia, standing in the park, offering him a bridge back to his own humanity. He picked up a heavy, leather-bound ledger from his desk, the one that contained the true names of the men who ran Oakhaven. He began to cross out names. Sterling, the city council chairman, the head of Apex Realty. These were men who traded in the suffering of others, men who thought they were untouchable because they held the deeds to the land. "You can buy the ground," Raphael said to the empty room, "but you can't buy the spirit of the people who walk on it." The scent of the sandwich was still on his fingers. It was a reminder of a promise he had made to a dying girl 30 years ago, a promise he had forgotten in his quest for vengeance. He had told Isabella he would make the world pay. He realized now that he had been paying the wrong people. He sat down at his desk and pulled a clean sheet of stationery toward him. He didn't write a threat. He didn't write a demand. He wrote a single sentence that would be hand-delivered to the principal of St. Jude by morning. "The debt is paid. The light stays on." "Lorenzo," Raphael called out, his voice echoing through the hollow halls of his mansion. "Cancel my meetings for the week. I have an acquisition to finalize. And tell the kitchen to prepare a meal, the best they can make. We're going to be hosting a lot of children very soon." As he looked out over his city, the King of Shadows finally understood that his greatest weapon wasn't the fear he inspired, but the protection he could provide. The scent of memory had led him home, and Oakhaven was about to find out what happens when a monster decides to become a guardian. The mahogany doors of the muddy boardroom swung open at exactly 6:00 p.m. inside. 3 men sat in high-backed chairs, their expensive silk ties loosened, their faces a mixture of confusion and suppressed arrogance. These were the architects of the South District's demise. Sterling, the predatory lead of Apex Realty, Councilman Hullowa, the man who had facilitated the slush fund kickbacks, and Miller, the bank's chief of foreclosures. They had been summoned not by a request, but by a command that carried the weight of a death warrant. Raphael entered the room without a word. He didn't sit. He walked to the head of the table and placed a small, crumpled brown paper bag on the polished wood. The contrast was jarring, the stained, cheap paper resting against the grain of a table that cost more than a teacher's yearly salary. "Do you know what this is, gentlemen?" Raphael asked, his voice a low, melodic threat. Sterling let out a short, nervous laugh. "A lunch, Don Raphael. I'm not sure I understand why we've been brought here." "It is a gift," Raphael interrupted, his eyes locking onto Sterling with a predatory intensity that silenced the room. "A gift from a 7-year-old girl who has nothing. She offered it to me because she thought I looked like I was hurting. She offered it because she believed that even a man like me deserved to be cared for." He leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "While she was offering me her only meal, you three were in a back room somewhere, signing the papers to take away her school. You were calculating the profit margins of her displacement. You were deciding that her future wasn't worth the land it was built on." Councilman Hullowa cleared his throat, his face turning a blotchy red. "Now look, Raphael, we have a deal. The distribution hub brings jobs, it brings revenue." "It brings your revenue, Hullowa," Raphael snapped. "I've spent 30 years in the shadows of this city. I know how the blood flows through these streets. I've been the one pumping it. But today, I realized that I've been feeding a hunger that can never be satisfied. I've been building an empire on the backs of children who are braver than every man in this room combined." He signaled to Laranza, who stepped forward and dropped 3 thick folders onto the table. They were filled with bank statements, recorded conversations, and digital trails, the kind of evidence that didn't just end careers but buried them. "This is the secret hunger of Ukhavan," Raphael said. "The greed that hides behind suits and city seals. Within an hour, these files will be in the hands of the federal prosecutor. Unless, of course, the ownership of Sant Juddahs changes hands before the sun goes down." Sterling's eyes went wide. "You're blackmailing us over a failing school in a slum." "I'm not blackmailing you," Raphael said, straightening his jacket. "I'm correcting a transaction. You thought the school was an asset to be liquidated. I am informing you that it is now a protected territory of the Muddy family. And as of this moment, Apex Realty is under hostile acquisition. I've already bought 40% of your outstanding debt. By midnight, I will own the chair you're sitting in." The silence in the room was absolute. Raphael picked up the paper bag, holding it with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his reputation. He thought of Sophia's small hand, the messy pigtails, and the way she hadn't flinched in the face of his darkness. He realized that the secret hunger wasn't just the greed of the men in front of him. It was the void in his own heart that had finally begun to fill. "You have 10 minutes to sign the transfer of the deed to the Muddy Foundation," Raphael said, walking toward the door. "If you don't, you'll find out that I'm much better at being a monster than I am at being a businessman." He didn't wait for an answer. He walked out of the boardroom and into the cool evening air of the balcony. Below him, the lights of Ukhavan twinkled like 1,000 tiny hopes. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a predator watching his prey. He felt like a guardian watching his home. He pulled the bruised red apple from the bag and took a bite. It was crisp and tart, the taste of a reality he had finally reclaimed. The King of Shadows was dead, and a new kind of boss was rising, one who understood that the greatest power in the world wasn't the ability to take, but the courage to give back. The sun hung low in the sky, a bruised orange orb bleeding into the smog of the horizon, as the black SUV glided like a shark through the narrow, potholed arteries of the South District. Don Raphael Muddy sat in the back, his eyes fixed on the small, retreating figure of Sophia. He had commanded empires and ordered the disappearance of men who thought they were untouchable, Yet today, his entire focus was anchored to a child with fraying pigtails and a backpack that seemed too heavy for her narrow shoulders. He had given a simple, chilling order to Marco: follow her. Do not let her see you. I want to see the world she returns to when the sun goes down. As the car trailed at a discreet distance, Raphael watched the transformation of the neighborhood. The further they drifted from the manicured parks of the center, the more the city seemed to lose its skin. The buildings here were skeletons of their former selves, brickwork crumbling like dry cake, windows patched with duct tape and cardboard. This was the territory Raphael claimed to rule, yet as he looked through the tinted glass, he realized he didn't rule it at all. He merely exploited its decay. He was a king of ruins. Sophia turned a corner, her small shoes skipping over a pile of uncollected refuse, and Raphael felt a tightening in his chest that no amount of expensive scotch could numb. She stopped in front of a tenement building that looked as though it were being held up by nothing more than the stubbornness of its residents. The front door hung slightly askew on its hinges, and the narrow hallway beyond was a tunnel of sickly yellow light. Raphael watched as Sophia paused at the entrance, adjusting her backpack and smoothing her skirt, a small, instinctive gesture of dignity before entering her sanctuary. He signaled for Marco to pull to the curb. For a long moment, the Don simply sat there, the engine purring like a tethered beast, as he stared at the threshold of Sophia's life. "Wait here," Raphael commanded. He stepped out of the car, his presence an immediate and jarring anomaly on the sidewalk. His charcoal suit and the glint of his gold watch drew eyes from every shadowed doorway and cracked window, but the air of lethal authority that radiated from him kept the neighborhood at a terrified distance. He walked toward the building, his footsteps measured and heavy. He wasn't following Sophia to harm her. He was following her to understand the depth of the debt he owed. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage, damp concrete, and the metallic tang of old pipes. He followed the sound of Sophia's voice, a bright melodic thread in the gloom, up 3 flights of stairs. He stopped at a door marked with a fatting plastic number 4. He didn't knock. He stood in the shadows of the landing, a ghost in a tailored suit, listening to the muffled sounds of a life lived on the edge of the abyss. "I'm home, Mama," Sophia's voice carried through the thin wood. "Did you eat your lunch, me umka?" A woman's voice responded, weary and brittle, the sound of someone who had been standing on her feet for 12 hours for a wage that barely covered the rent. There was a pause, a silence so heavy Raphael could feel it in his own marrow. "Yes," Sophia lied, her voice unwavering in its love. "It was delicious. The yellow cheese was the best part." Raphael closed his eyes, his hand gripping the banister so hard the wood groaned. He could see it in his mind, the mother skipping her own meal to pack that paper bag, and the daughter giving it away to a monster because she thought he looked hurting. It was a cycle of sacrifice that he had never encountered in the boardroom or the back alley. In his world, everyone took. In this world, everyone gave until there was nothing left but bone and spirit. He descended the stairs, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He didn't need to see the empty cupboards or the unpaid utility bills. He had heard the truth in that single, beautiful lie. As he stepped back out into the cooling evening air, he looked across the street toward the looming silhouette of the neighborhood parish school, St. Jutta. It sat behind a rusted chain-link fence, a Victorian relic of red brick and boarded-up windows. Raphael walked toward it, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the large, fluorescent sign zip-tied to the gate. School closing permanently at the end of the semester. Below it, in smaller, colder letters, was the name of the development firm, Apex Realty. He reached out and touched the rusted wire of the fence. He remembered the reports Lorenzo had brought him, the redevelopment plans, the economic optimization of the district. He had authorized these movements months ago, seeing them as nothing more than lines on a ledger. He had viewed the closure of the school as a tactical necessity for a new warehouse district. But now, standing where Sophia stood every morning, he saw it for what it truly was, an execution. To close this school was to cut the last cord of hope for the children of the South District. It was to tell Sophia that her kindness had no place in a world built on profit. Don Raphael, Marco had followed him, standing a respectful 5 paces back. The scouts are reporting that the Apex board is meeting tonight to finalize the sale. They're moving fast to avoid any local protests. Raphael didn't turn around. He kept his gaze fixed on the closing soon sign, the words searing into his mind. "They think they are moving fast," Raphael whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "They have no idea what speed looks like. They think they are buying a plot of land. They don't realize they are trying to buy the ground out from under a girl who shared her lunch with a devil." He turned then, his eyes burning with a dark, crystalline fire that made even Marco, a man who had seen Raphael execute traitors without blinking, take a half step back. The King of Shadows was no longer just a title. It was a promise of the darkness he was about to unleash on the men who thought they could trade Sophia's future for a percentage. "Get Lorenzo on the phone," Raphael commanded as he strode back to the SUV. "I want the private files on every board member of Apex Realty. I want their bank accounts, their mistresses, their offshore holdings, and their deepest fears. I want to know what they love so I can show them what it feels like to lose it." "And the school, sir?" Raphael paused at the car door, looking back at the darkened windows of the tenement where Sophia was likely sitting at a cramped table, doing her homework by the light of a flickering bulb. "The school isn't closing, Marco. By tomorrow afternoon, the sign on that fence will be gone, and the men who put it there will be lucky if they still have shoes on their feet." As the car tore away from the curb, the tires screaming against the asphalt, Raphael didn't feel the usual cold satisfaction of a planned hit. He felt a frantic, desperate need to act. He realized that for 30 years, he had been hungry for power, for money, for respect. But as he clutched the memory of Sophia's lie to her mother, he realized he was finally hungry for something that mattered. He was hungry for justice. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. A contact in the governor's office who owed him a debt that could never be repaid in cash. "This is Morty," Raphael said when the line picked up. "I'm calling in the favor. I need an injunction on the South District redevelopment project. I need it in 10 minutes. And if you tell me it's impossible, I'll remind you where the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively." He hung up without waiting for a response. He looked at the seat next to him, where the empty brown paper bag still sat, a humble relic of a saint. He had lived his life by the sword, but tonight he would use the very system he had corrupted to save the only thing in this city worth saving. The shadow was no longer just following Sophia home. The shadow was now standing guard over her door, and woe to any man who tried to cross the threshold. The SUV disappeared into the night, a black streak against the crumbling gray of the district. Don Raphael Morty had spent a lifetime taking things away from people. Tomorrow, for the first time, he was going to give something back, and he was going to make sure the world felt the weight of the gift. The penthouse boardroom of the Morty Tower was a glass-walled cage suspended over the glimmering, deceptive lights of Oakhaven. At midnight, the city looked peaceful, but inside the room, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that made the air feel electrified. Don Raphael Morty stood at the head of the long obsidian table, his back to the room as he watched the traffic crawl like glowing insects far below. Seated at the table were the 7 men who managed the financial arteries of his empire, lawyers with souls made of parchment, accountants who could hide $1 billion in a single line of code, and fixers who specialized in the quiet destruction of lives. They had been summoned with a code-red urgency, a signal usually reserved for impending federal raids or the start of a multi-family war. They sat in a silence so profound that the soft hum of the air filtration system sounded like a roar. Raphael turned slowly, his face illuminated by the cold, blue-gray light of the city. He looked at the men who had helped him build a mountain of wealth on a foundation of fear. For the first time in their long association, he didn't see them as assets. He saw them as the same kind of parasites he had just encountered in the South District. He adjusted the gold link on his cuff, the metal catching the light with a sharp, clinical glint. He didn't sit down. To sit was to invite a conversation, and Raphael was here to deliver a decree. "Gentlemen," Raphael began, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that seemed to resonate in the very marrow of those listening. "You are all wondering why I have pulled you from your beds and your mistresses. You are looking for the enemy. You are waiting for me to give you a name to erase or a territory to seize. You are looking for a war." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the table, lingering on each man until they looked away. "And you are right. We are at war. But the enemy is not the Genovese family, and the territory is not the docks." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper, the deed to a massive industrial complex on the waterfront, a property known as the Forge. It was the crown jewel of the Morty portfolio, a $300 million asset that generated more clean revenue than any other wing of his operation. The men at the table leaned forward instinctively. The Forge was untouchable. It was the legacy piece. "I am liquidating the Forge," Raphael announced. The silence that followed was not just quiet, it was a vacuum. Lorenzo, usually the most stoic of the group, actually gasped. "Don Raphael," he stammered, his hands trembling slightly on the mahogany surface. "The Forge is our primary lever in the shipping industry. It provides the legal cover for nearly 40% of our logistics. To sell it now in this market would be catastrophic to our liquidity. Why would we do this?" "Because," Raphael said, his eyes turning into chips of dark flint, "I have found a more pressing investment. We are not selling it to a competitor. We are liquidating it into a blind trust. I want the cash accessible within 6 hours. I want every cent moved through the offshore accounts in the Caymans and then repatriated as a direct charitable endowment to the Morty Foundation." "A charity," the head accountant, a man named Silas who had a face like a dried apple, looked as if he were about to have a stroke. "Don Raphael, with all due respect, we use the foundation for tax shielding and minor community grants to keep the police off our backs. We don't dump $300 million into it. The IRS will be on us like wolves. The optics alone—" "I don't care about the optics, Silas," Raphael cut him off, his voice dropping an octave into a territory of pure menace. "And I don't care about the IRS. I have already instructed our contacts in the governor's office to provide the necessary regulatory fog. Tonight, we are not businessmen. We are not even criminals. We are ghosts." He walked to the window and tapped on the glass, pointing toward the darkened, sagging silhouette of the South District in the distance. "Down there in the dirt is a school. St. Jude. It is being strangled by a company called Apex Realty. They think they are the apex predators of this city because they have a few city councilmen in their pockets and a predatory loan on a brick building. They think they can take the future away from a girl named Sophia because she is small and her mother is tired." Raphael turned back to the table, his presence suddenly dwarfing the room. "Apex is moving to finalize the foreclosure on Monday. They want the land for a distribution hub. They want to turn a place of learning into a place of storage. I want you to find every piece of debt Apex owes. I want you to buy their lenders. I want you to squeeze their credit lines until they can't breathe. And then, I want the foundation to step in and buy the school, the land, and the 3 city blocks surrounding it." "3 blocks," Lorenzo whispered. "Raphael, that's not a donation, that's a kingdom." "It is a sanctuary," Raphael corrected him. "I want the school renovated. I want the best teachers in the state hired with salaries that make them feel like gods. I want a kitchen that serves 3 hot meals a day to every student free of charge. I want a library that makes the public one look like a gutter. And I want it all done under the name of the Alvarez Educational Center, not mine. My name stays in the shadows where it belongs." The men at the table looked at each other in utter disbelief. They had seen Raphael Morty order hits that lasted for weeks. They had seen him bankrupt rivals and laugh as their empires crumbled. But they had never seen this, a frantic, high-stakes blitz to save something purely because it was good. They didn't understand the special project because they hadn't seen the crumpled paper bag. They hadn't felt the sting of a child's mercy. "What about the board of Apex?" Silas asked, his voice shaking. "They won't just sell because we ask. They're tied into the city council. They've already spent the kickbacks." Raphael's smile was a terrifying thing to behold, a thin, sharp line that didn't reach his eyes. "That is where the blitz comes in. Lorenzo, you have the files I requested. By dawn, I want every member of the Apex board to wake up to a phone call. I don't want them threatened with violence. I want them threatened with reality. I want them to know that I own their mortgages. I want them to know I know about the offshore accounts Holloway is using to hide the school's demolition fees. Give them a choice. They can sell to the Foundation at a loss and keep their freedom, or they can fight me and lose everything they've ever stolen." He leaned over the table, his hands planted firmly on the obsidian. "This is the most important hit of my career. We are not killing a man tonight. We are killing a system. We are liquidating the King of Shadows to pay for the soul of Don Raphael Morty. If any of you have a problem with that, if any of you think your percentages are more important than the meal that little girl gave me, you can leave this room right now. But I promise you, you won't make it to the lobby." No one moved. The silence returned, but this time it was filled with a frantic, desperate energy. The lawyers began opening their laptops. The accountants reached for their phones. The fixers began scrolling through maps of the city's financial vulnerabilities. The boardroom blitz had begun. Raphael watched them for a moment, the cold weight of his past finally beginning to lift. He felt a strange, light sensation in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known since he was a boy sharing a piece of bread with Isabella. It wasn't the rush of power or the heat of anger. It was the quiet, steady hum of purpose. He was using the very tools of his corruption to build a fortress for the innocent. He was using his darkness to protect the light. "Move," Raphael commanded. As the room erupted into a frenzy of high-stakes financial warfare, Raphael walked back to the window. He looked out at the South District, his eyes finding the general area where Sophia's tenement stood. He thought of the "closing soon" sign and how it would look when it was torn down. He thought of the good kind of yellow cheese and the way Sophia had lied to her mother to protect her heart. "The debt is being paid, Sophia," he whispered against the glass, "and the interest is going to be more than this city can imagine." He stood there for the next 6 hours, a sentinel in a tailored suit, as his empire was dismantled and rebuilt into a shield. He watched the sun begin to peek over the horizon, its first rays hitting the glass of the tower like a benediction. By 6:00 a.m., Lorenzo approached him, his face pale and sweat-beaded, but holding a digital tablet with a triumphant hand. "It's done, Don Raphael," Lorenzo said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "The forge is liquidated. The funds have cleared. Apex Realty signed the transfer of the deed 10 minutes ago. They didn't even negotiate. They were too busy trying to delete their hard drives." Raphael took the tablet and looked at the confirmation. The school was his. The land was his. The future of the South District was now under the protection of the Morty name, though the world would only see the Alvarez Center. "Good," Raphael said, his voice steady and calm. "Now get the car. I want to be at the school before the first bell rings. I want to see the look on the principal's face when he finds out he no longer has to beg for the heat to stay on." As he walked out of the boardroom, leaving the exhausted architects of his empire behind, Raphael Morty felt a sense of completion that no hit or payoff had ever provided. He was still a man of shadows, but he was no longer a king of ruins. He was a guardian, and as he stepped into the elevator, he reached into his pocket and touched the empty brown paper bag, the most valuable thing he had ever owned. The morning mist was a thin, gray shroud that clung to the cracked pavement of the South District, blurring the sharp edges of the tenements and the rusted skeletons of abandoned cars. Don Raphael Morty did not arrive in his usual motorcade of black SUVs. Instead, he sat in the passenger seat of a nondescript, 10-year-old sedan, wearing a simple navy windbreaker over a plain white t-shirt. The gold watch was gone, replaced by a cheap plastic timepiece, and the slick-back hair had been ruffled to hide the razor-sharp precision of his usual grooming. He looked like a man who had spent his life working a loading dock, tired, invisible, and utterly unremarkable. This was the only way he could see the truth. In a suit, people showed him what they thought he wanted to see, a polished version of reality. In this disguise, they would show him the world as it was. He stepped out of the car a block away from St. Jude's, his boots crunching on the glass and gravel that littered the sidewalk. The cold air bit at his skin, carrying the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of the nearby rail yards. He walked toward the school, his eyes scanning the perimeter with the instinct of a man who had spent decades calculating vulnerabilities. From a distance, the red brick building looked like a sturdy fortress of education. Up close, it was a tragedy. The mortar between the bricks was crumbling into a fine, red dust, and the window frames were so warped by moisture that they had pulled away from the walls, leaving jagged gaps that let the heat bleed out into the hungry morning air. As he reached the gate, Raphael saw a janitor, a man with a face like a crumpled map and a back bent by years of heavy lifting, struggling with a chain-link fence that had been cut near the bottom. Raphael stopped, watching the man try to weave a piece of rusted wire through the gap. "Tough job for a Sunday morning," Raphael said, his voice dropping into the rough, unrefined cadence of the streets. The janitor didn't look up, his fingers working the wire with a practiced, weary rhythm. "Ain't just Sunday, it's every morning. The local kids use the playground for things that ain't playing. I spend half my life patching this fence and the other half scrubbing the things they write on the walls. Not that it matters. They're closing us down in a few weeks anyway." "I heard about that," Raphael said, leaning against a brick pillar that felt dangerously loose. "Why bother fixing it then?" The man finally looked up, his eyes milky and tired. "Because as long as there's one kid walking through those doors, they deserve to feel like someone gives a damn, even if the city don't, even if the diocese don't." He spat on the ground and returned to his work. "You looking for work because we ain't hearing, we're barely paying the electric." "Just passing through," Raphael lied, a sharp pang of guilt lancing through his chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of crumpled bills, pressing them into the man's hand as he walked past. "Buy some better wire." He entered the building through a side door that didn't quite lock. The interior of St. Jude was even worse than the exterior. The air was heavy with the smell of floor wax and mildew, a combination that hit Raphael with the force of a sensory memory. He walked down the main hallway, the linoleum tiles beneath his feet cracked and peeling like sunburnt skin. Above him, the fluorescent lights flickered and hummed, a staccato rhythm that sounded like a dying heart. He looked up and saw the brown, water-stained circles on the ceiling tiles, some of which were sagging so low they looked ready to burst. He followed the sound of a steady, rhythmic drip-drip-drip to the cafeteria. It was a cavernous room with long, folding tables that had been wiped clean so many times the laminate had worn through to the wood. In the center of the room, a series of plastic buckets had been strategically placed to catch the rainwater leaking through the roof. The water was a murky, tea-colored liquid, a testament to the rot hidden within the ceiling. Raphael walked to the kitchen service window and peered inside. The cafeteria was empty, not just of people but of life. The large industrial refrigerators were humming loudly, their seals cracked and taped together with silver duct tape. He pushed open the swinging door and walked to the pantry. He opened the heavy steel door, expecting to see crates of apples, bags of rice, or even the industrial-sized cans of preserved vegetables that schools usually stocked. Instead, he saw 3 boxes of generic cereal, a dozen loaves of white bread, and a single, lonely jar of peanut butter. The good kind of yellow cheese Sophia had mentioned wasn't here. It wasn't anywhere. Raphael felt a cold, simmering rage begin to boil in his stomach. He had spent his life surrounded by excess. He had eaten meals that cost more than this entire pantry. He had thrown away more food in a single week than this school appeared to have for 100 children. He thought of the $300 million he had moved last night. It felt like a drop of water in an ocean of neglect. He reached out and touched the cold, empty shelf of the pantry, his hand trembling with a sudden, violent emotion. He wasn't just looking at a failing school, he was looking at a crime scene. "Can I help you, sir?" Raphael spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon he wasn't carrying. Standing in the doorway was a woman in her late 50s, her gray hair pulled into a tight, sensible bun. She wore a cardigan that had been mended at the elbows and held a clipboard to her chest like a shield. Her eyes were sharp and suspicious, the eyes of a woman who had spent her life defending children from a world that wanted to discard them. "I'm with the insurance company," Raphael lied, his voice steadying, "checking the roof damage." The woman let out a short, bitter laugh. "Insurance? We haven't had a visit from an insurance agent in 5 years. They don't even return our calls anymore. They know the building is a total loss. I'm Sister Margaret, the principal. If you're here to tell me we're a fire hazard, save your breath. I already know." "I'm just doing the appraisal," Raphael said, his gaze shifting to the buckets in the cafeteria. "How do you feed the kids with an empty pantry, sister?" Margaret walked over to the buckets, her expression softening into a look of profound, lingering sadness. "We don't, not officially. The state funding was cut 3 months ago because our enrollment numbers dropped below the threshold. Most days, the teachers bring in what they can. We make sandwiches. We divide what we have. Some days, we just pray the hunger isn't too loud during math class." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face. "You look like a man who's seen a lot of hard things. But have you ever looked into the eyes of a 7-year-old girl who's trying to tell you she isn't hungry so her little brother can have her crust? It's a sound you never forget. It's the sound of a soul breaking before it's even had a chance to grow." Raphael looked away, his eyes landing on a small, hand-drawn poster on the cafeteria wall. It was a picture of a sun rising over a green field, with the words "The Future Belongs to US" written in crayon. He thought of Sophia. He thought of her pigtails and her faded uniform, and the way she had offered him her lunch bag in the park. She had walked through these halls, sat at these broken tables, and learned to be brave in a building that was literally falling down around her. "What would it take?" Raphael asked, his voice a low rumble, "to fix it all? The roof, the kitchen, the books, everything." Margaret sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire South District. "It would take a miracle, millions of dollars, a new heating system, a full kitchen staff, a library that actually has books from this century. But miracles don't happen in Oakhaven, not for people like us. We're just waiting for the bulldozers now." Raphael looked at the leaking ceiling, the empty pantry, and the weary woman standing before him. He felt the weight of the brown paper bag in his memory, a gift of pure, unadulterated kindness that had been given in the midst of this decay. He realized then that he wasn't just here to buy a building. He was here to build a cathedral for that kindness. "Check the gate tomorrow morning, sister," Raphael said, walking toward the door. "I think you'll find that miracles have a funny way of showing up when you least expect them." "Wait," Margaret called out, "who are you?" Raphael stopped in the doorway, the gray morning light framing his silhouette. He didn't look like a mob boss. He didn't look like a laborer. He looked like a man who had finally found the bottom of his own soul. "Just a man who's tired of being hungry," Raphael said. He walked out of the school and back to the waiting car. As he sat in the passenger seat, he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed Lorenzo. "The appraisal is finished," Raphael said, his voice cold and sharp as a razor. "I want the contractors at the gate by 5:00 a.m. tomorrow. I want the roof replaced, the kitchen fully stocked with organic produce and fresh meat, and the heating system overhauled. I want the best tech and the best books. And I want the closing soon sign burned, not taken down, burned." "Don Raphael," Lorenzo's voice was hesitant, "the costs for a rush job like that." "I don't care about the costs," Raphael roared, his voice echoing in the small car. "I want that school to look like a palace. I want Sophia to walk into that building tomorrow and feel like she's the queen of the world. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Don Raphael, it will be done." Raphael hung up and looked back at the crumbling red bricks of St. Jude. He saw the janitor still working on the fence, and he saw a few children beginning to gather at the gate, their breath visible in the cold air. He realized that for 30 years he had been a king of shadows. But as he watched the sun finally break through the gray clouds, illuminating the school for a fleeting second, he knew that the shadows were retreating. He was going to give Sophia a world where she never had to lie about being hungry again. And if he had to burn the city to the ground to do it, he would. The clock on the wall of the city council's executive chamber struck 8:00 a.m., and the silence of the room was shattered not by a knock, but by the heavy, synchronized thud of mahogany doors being forced open. Councilman Holloway, still nursing a lukewarm coffee and a sense of smug security, looked up to see a phalanx of men in black suits marching toward his desk. They weren't the usual local thugs or the groveling developers he was used to intimidating. These were men with eyes like flint and briefcases that felt like weapons. At their head was Lorenzo, Raphael Morty's primary architect of legal destruction, flanked by 4 of the highest-paid acquisition attorneys in the state. They didn't wait for an invitation to sit. They surrounded the table like a storm front, unfolding documents with a clinical, terrifying precision. "What is the meaning of this?" Holloway stammered, his face flushing a deep, guilty crimson. "We have a closed session meeting scheduled for the Apex development. You can't just barge in here." "The Apex development is dead, Councilman," Lorenzo said, his voice as cold and flat as a frozen lake. He dropped a thick, leather-bound folder onto the desk with a sound like a gavel. "As of 4 o'clock this morning, the Morty Foundation has acquired the debt, the deed, and the outstanding liabilities of St. Jude's Elementary. We are not here to negotiate. We are here to inform you of the change in management." Holloway reached for his phone, his fingers trembling. "Apex has a contract. The city has a plan for that land. You can't just buy a school out from under a municipal redevelopment project. There are laws, there are protocols." "Protocol is for people who have something to hide, Councilman," one of the attorneys interjected, sliding a second document across the desk. "This is a comprehensive audit of the slush fund you've been using to facilitate the Apex deal. It details every kickback, every offshore transfer, and every consultation fee paid to your brother-in-law's shell company. If you'd like, we can call the district attorney right now and discuss protocol in a courtroom. Or you can sign the municipal release forms and acknowledge the foundation's right of first refusal." Holloway looked at the paper, and the blood drained from his face until he was the color of sour milk. He looked at the men surrounding him and realized he wasn't looking at lawyers. He was looking at the physical manifestation of Don Raphael Muddy's wrath. The King of Shadows had stepped out of the darkness and into the light of the law, and he was using that light to blind them. While the legal execution was unfolding at City Hall, a different kind of takeover was occurring at the First National Bank. Sterling, the lead from Apex Realty, was standing in the lobby, screaming at a bank manager who looked like he wanted to crawl into the floorboards. Sterling had arrived to finalize the foreclosure, ready to sign the papers that would officially end the life of St. Jude. But when he handed over his authorization, the manager had simply shaken his head. "The account is frozen, Mr. Sterling," the manager whispered. "A third-party entity has purchased the entire commercial loan portfolio of Apex Realty. You don't own the debt anymore. You are the debt." "Who bought it?" Sterling roared, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "I want a name." As if on cue, the heavy glass doors of the bank opened, and Don Raphael Muddy stepped inside. He wasn't wearing the navy windbreaker anymore. He was back in his charcoal wool suit, the gold signet ring glinting on his hand, his presence turning the grand lobby into a private audience chamber. He walked toward Sterling with a slow, measured pace that radiated a terrifying sense of calm. The security guards, recognizing the apex predator in the room, instinctively looked the other way. "You're looking for a name, Sterling?" Raphael asked, stopping inches from the man. The name is Muddy, but for the purpose of this transaction, you can think of me as the man who is about to take everything you've ever stolen and give it back to the people you stole it from. You can't do this, Raphael, Sterling hissed, his eyes darting around the lobby for an escape. This is a hostile takeover. It's illegal. I'll sue you into the ground. Go ahead, Raphael said, a thin, sharp smile touching his lips. My lawyers are currently at City Hall showing Councilman Hullowa the evidence of your racketeering. By noon, the only thing you'll be suing for is a better cellmate. You thought you could trade a child's future for a warehouse. You thought you could close a school because the people inside were too poor to fight back. Raphael leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade against Sterling's throat. You didn't realize that the puss girl in this city has a protector you can't afford. Raphael turned to the bank manager, ignoring Sterling's sputtering rage. The wire transfer for the full payoff of the Sunt. Juddah's mortgage has cleared. I want the deed released to the Muddy Foundation immediately. And I want the foreclosure notice on the front gate of the school removed by a professional crew within 30 minutes. If it's still there when the first student arrives, I'll consider it a personal insult. Yes, Don Raphael, the manager said, his voice cracking. Immediately. As Raphael walked out of the bank, he felt the weight of the morning's work settling in his shoulders. It was a different kind of exhaustion than the one that followed a gang war. This was the exhaustion of a man who had just spent $300 million to buy a soul. He stepped into his waiting SUV and checked his watch. At 5:45 a.m., the first bell at Sunt. Juddah's would ring in 15 minutes. The school, Raphael commanded. The drive back to the South District felt shorter than it had the night before. The city was waking up, the streets filling with people who had no idea that their world had been reshaped in the hours before dawn. As they approached Sunt, Juddah's, Raphael saw the fleet of trucks he had ordered. Plumbers, roofers, and electricians were already swarming the building like a benevolent army. He saw a crew with a heavy-duty torch melting the zip ties on the "Closing Soon" sign, tearing it down and tossing it into the back of a dumpster. But he wasn't looking for the contractors. He was looking for a pair of pigtails. He saw her standing at the gate, her small hand clutching the rusted wire. Sophia was looking up at the men who were tearing down the sign, her face a mask of confusion and hope. Beside her stood Sister Mugrut, her clipboard forgotten, her eyes wide as she watched a truck from a high-end catering company unload crates of fresh fruit and milk into the cafeteria. Raphael signaled for Marco to stop the car. He didn't get out. He didn't want the credit and he didn't want the gratitude. He just wanted to see. He watched as a man in a hard hat walked over to Sophia and handed her a brand new backpack, one that was sturdy, bright, and didn't have straps that dug into her shoulders. He saw the man point toward the school doors, where the flicker of new, warm lighting was already visible in the hallways. He watched Sophia look toward the school, then toward the street, her eyes searching for something. For a fleeting second, her gaze landed on the black SUV with the tinted windows. Raphael froze, his hand pressed against the glass. He didn't know if she could see him, but he felt a connection that defied the physical barrier of the car. She didn't smile, but she nodded. A small, grave acknowledgement of a miracle she couldn't explain but instinctively understood. The takeover is complete, Lorenzo said from the front seat, his voice filled with an uncharacteristic note of pride. The school is officially safe. The debt is gone. The faculty has been paid through the next 5 years and the endowment is secured. Raphael watched Sophia walk through the gates, her new backpack bouncing against her spine, her head held a little higher than it had been the day before. He saw the janitor he had spoken to earlier, now wearing a brand new uniform and wielding a professional-grade power washer against the graffiti on the brick walls. The man looked 10 years younger, his back strutta, his movements energized by the simple fact that his work finally mattered. "Drive," Raphael said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. As the car pulled away, Raphael looked back one last time at the red bricks of Sunt, Judah. It was still an old building in a hard neighborhood, but it was no longer a ruin. It was a fortress. It was a place where the good kind of yellow cheese would be a reality, not a lie told to protect a mother's heart. He had used his power to silence the predators and his wealth to fuel the light. He was still a man of shadows, but as the sun hit the windshield, illuminating the interior of the car, Raphael Muddy realized that, for the first time in 30 years, he wasn't afraid of what the light would reveal. He reached into the pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out the crumpled brown paper bag. He didn't throw it away. He folded it carefully and placed it in the center console, a reminder of the gift that had saved his life. He had bought a school, but a 7-year-old girl had bought his soul, and in the grand ledger of the Muddy Empire, it was the only deal that truly mattered. "What's next, boss?" Marco asked, his eyes meeting Raphael's in the rearview mirror. Raphael looked out at the city of Ukhavan, seeing it not as a territory to be exploited, but as a garden to be tended. There were more schools, more tenements, and more children like Sophia waiting for a miracle. The King of Shadows had retired. The Guardian was just getting started. "Next," Raphael said, a faint, genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "Next, we find out who else in this city thinks they can take things away from children. I think I'm going to be very busy." The morning air in the South District of Ukhavan was usually a stagnant mixture of industrial exhaust and the scent of damp asphalt, but today, there was a crispness to the breeze that felt like a long-awaited breath. Don Raphael Muddy sat in the back of his parked vehicle 2 blocks away from Sant Juddah's. His window rolled down just enough to let the sounds of the neighborhood filter into the cabin. He had watched the sun rise over the jagged skyline, its light catching the newly cleaned bricks of the schoolhouse. Gone were the plywood boards and the graffiti-stained doors. In their place stood polished oak and reinforced glass that shimmered like a promise. The "Closing Soon" sign had been replaced by a bronze plaque that caught the first rays of the sun, bearing the name of the Muddy Foundation in a script that spoke of permanence rather than temporary reprieve. Raphael watched the neighborhood wake up to a reality they hadn't yet learned to trust. Mothers walked their children to the gate with hesitant steps, their eyes scanning the unfamiliar sight of professional security guards who weren't there to intimidate but to welcome. He saw the shift in the posture of the community. The bowed heads and hurried paces were being replaced by a cautious, wide-eyed wonder. He adjusted his tie, the silk cool against his fingers, and felt a quiet, thrumming energy in his chest. For 30 years, his business had been about the extraction of life, the taking of time, money, and peace. Today, he was a spectator to the opposite. He was watching the infusion of hope into a place that had been bled dry. At precisely 7:45 a.m., the first bell rang. It wasn't the shrill, dying rattle he had heard during his incognito visit. This was a deep, resonant chime that echoed through the narrow alleys and bounced off the tenement walls, a clarion call that announced a new era. Raphael signaled for Marco to pull closer. He didn't want to be the center of attention, the Don who demanded a ribbon-cutting ceremony. He wanted to be a shadow in the background, a silent architect watching his blueprint come to life. As the car crawled to the curb, the doors of the school swung wide, and the scent of the new world he had bought hit him through the open window. It was the smell of fresh paint, floor wax, and something far more intoxicating, the aroma of a fully funded kitchen. The scent of roasting chicken, steamed vegetables, and fresh-baked bread wafted into the street, a sensory miracle that stopped parents in their tracks. Raphael saw children stop and sniff the air, their faces breaking into disbelief. For many of them, breakfast was a luxury and lunch was a lie. Now the air itself told them they were safe. He watched Sister Margaret stand on the front steps, her cardigan replaced by a crisp, new blazer, her eyes wet with a joy she didn't try to hide. She was no longer a woman guarding a ruin. She was a woman presiding over a kingdom. She waved the children inside, and for the first time in years, they didn't shuffle. They ran. Raphael's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the one face that had started it all. He found Sophia near the back of the line, standing with her mother. The woman looked stunned, her hand clutching a flyer that detailed the new Full Circle nutrition program Raphael had personally mandated. Sophia, however, looked exactly as she had in the park, calm, observant, and possessed of a quiet wisdom that transcended her years. She was wearing her new backpack, the straps adjusted perfectly, and her pigtails were tied with bright yellow ribbons that matched the color of the cheese she had once lied about. She looked up at the school, her eyes lingering on the new windows and the clean brickwork, and then she turned her head. Her gaze found the black SUV. Raphael felt his breath hitch. He sat back in the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was a man who had stared down federal agents and rival executioners without flinching, yet the gaze of this 7-year-old girl made him feel exposed, his every sin laid bare. Sophia didn't wave and she didn't shout. She simply stood still for a moment, the yellow ribbons on her hair fluttering in the breeze, and gave a small, solemn nod. It was a gesture of recognition between two people who had made a secret pact in a park. She knew the monster had listened. As Sophia disappeared into the building, Raphael turned his attention to the windows of the first floor, where the new cafeteria was located. Through the glass, he could see the transformation he had funded with the liquidation of his most prized asset. The plastic buckets were gone. The ceiling was a seamless expanse of white. The long, broken tables had been replaced by sturdy, circular ones that encouraged conversation and community. Behind the service counter, a team of professional chefs in clean whites were dishing out plates of food that would have been at home in a high-end bistro. He watched as the children sat down, their movements tentative at first, then hurried as the reality of the abundance set in. He saw the janitor, now the head of a 3-man maintenance team, standing by the kitchen door with a plate in his hand and a look of stunned gratitude on his face. The man looked at the ceiling, then at the floor, then at the children, and he shook his head as if he were dreaming. Raphael felt a lump in his throat that he had to swallow twice. He had spent hundreds of millions of dollars to achieve this, yet as he watched a small boy take a bite of a fresh apple and look at it as if it were a jewel, he realized he had never made a more profitable investment. The dividends weren't in cash. They were in the repair of the human spirit. The kitchen staff reports that they have enough for 300 students and their families for the next year, Don Raphael, Lorenzo said from the front seat, his voice unusually soft. The supply chains are secured through our legal distributors. No one will ever go hungry in this building again, not on our watch. Raphael nodded, his eyes still fixed on the scene inside. He thought of his sister Isabella, and the way the hunger had dimmed her eyes until they were just hollow sockets of glass. He thought of the cold, dark rooms of his youth and the bitter taste of the poverty that had forged him into a weapon. He couldn't change his own past, and he couldn't bring Isabella back. But as he watched the children of St. Jude's eat their fill in the warm light of a safe room, he felt a part of his own history being rewritten. He was no longer just the man who had survived the shadows. He was the man who had turned the lights back on. The Board of Education called this morning, Lorenzo continued, scrolling through a tablet. They're asking questions about the Morty Foundation and the sudden infusion of capital. They want to know our long-term goals. Raphael turned away from the window, his expression returning to the ironclad resolve that had made him a king. Tell them our goal is simple, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Tell them we are fixing what they broke, and tell them that if they try to interfere, if they try to redirect a single cent of this endowment or slow down the renovations of the playground, I will consider it an act of war. They can deal with the foundation in the daylight, or they can deal with me in the dark. The choice is theirs. He sat back, the luxury of the SUV finally feeling like a tool rather than a shield. He had spent his life building walls to keep people out, but today he had built a door. He watched the last of the children enter the school, the heavy oak doors closing softly behind them. The street returned to a semblance of its usual quiet, but the air was different. The scent of the kitchen remained, a lingering evidence of the miracle. "What now, boss?" Marco asked, his hand on the gearshift. Raphael looked at the brown paper bag sitting in the center console. It was empty now, but it still felt heavy with the weight of the moment that had saved him. He thought of the other schools in the South District, the other tenements where mothers were skipping meals, and the other children who were being forced to be brave before they were ready. He realized that St. Jude was only the beginning. He had a city to rebuild and a lifetime of debts to pay. "Drive to the north end," Raphael commanded, his eyes burning with a new, relentless purpose. "I want to see the condition of the middle school on 5th, and call the contractor. Tell him he's going to need more men. We're not done yet." As the car pulled away, the first bell of the next chapter began to ring in Raphael's heart. He was still the king of shadows, but he was finally ruling a kingdom worth having. The debt was being paid, the hunger was being fed, and for the first time in 30 years, Don Raphael Morty was at peace with the man in the mirror. He had bought a school, but he had gained a future. And as the SUV disappeared into the morning light, the South District felt just a little bit less like a ruin and a little more like home. The golden hour of autumn had descended upon Oakhaven, painting the rugged brickwork of the South District in shades of amber and honey. It had been 6 months since the day a crumpled brown paper bag had changed the trajectory of the city's underworld, and the transformation was no longer a headline. It was a heartbeat. St. Jude, now officially the Alvarez Educational Center, stood as a beacon of impossible glass and sturdy stone amidst the fatting gray of the tenements. The closing soon sign was a distant memory, replaced by a playground that swarmed with the chaotic, joyful energy of children who no longer had to play in the dirt. Don Raphael Morty watched it all from the back of his car, parked in the long shadows of a nearby warehouse. He was a man who had spent his life in the dark, but for the first time, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like a witness. Inside the school, the morning sun poured through the high, arched windows of the second-grade classroom. Sofia Alvarez walked to her desk, her movements possessed of a new, quiet confidence. She no longer wore the faded, paper-thin uniform that had marked her as a child of scarcity. Her clothes were new, her shoes were sturdy, and her pigtails were tied with silk ribbons that caught the light. But it wasn't the clothes that had changed her. It was the weight lifted from her shoulders. She sat down and saw a package resting on her desk. A sleek, navy blue backpack made of the kind of durable material that could survive a lifetime of dreams. She opened the front pocket and found a heavy, cream-colored envelope embossed with a gold seal she didn't recognize. Inside was a letter, written in a hand that was firm and elegant. It didn't speak of charity or pity. It spoke of an investment. It was a lifetime scholarship, a promise that her education, from this small desk to the highest halls of any university she chose, was already paid for. There was no name at the bottom, only a simple, hand-drawn symbol of a small paper bag. Sophia traced the ink with her finger, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. She looked toward the window, her eyes scanning the street until they landed on the dark SUV parked in the distance. She didn't need to see through the tinted glass to know who was there. She knew that the man who looked hurting had found his way to heal. From his vantage point, Raphael saw her silhouette in the window. He saw her hold the letter to her chest, and he saw the way she looked out at the world, not with the wary eyes of a survivor, but with the bright, hungry gaze of a leader. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a quietude that had eluded him since the night Isabella died. He had spent decades trying to build a fortress to keep the world away, but in building a sanctuary for Sophia, he had finally found his own way home. He was still a man of immense power, and his name still commanded a terrified respect in the boardrooms and back alleys, but the nature of that power had shifted. He was no longer a predator, he was a patron. He was a different kind of boss, one who understood that the only legacy worth leaving was the one that lived on in the eyes of a child who was no longer afraid. The transition hadn't been easy. There were those in his organization who saw his philanthropy as a sign of softening, a crack in the iron mask. He had handled those dissenters with the same cold efficiency he always had, but with a new ultimatum. The Morty Empire would no longer profit from the misery of the neighborhoods that housed its soul. He had liquidated the drug dens and the predatory lending hubs, replacing them with community centers and vocational schools. He had turned his fixers into facilitators of growth. He was still the king of shadows, but he was now using those shadows to provide cover for the light to grow. He had realized that you don't need to rule with a fist if you can lead with a vision that people are willing to die for. As the first bell of the afternoon rang, Sophia stepped out onto the playground, leading a group of her classmates toward the new library. Raphael watched her, his heart swelling with a pride that was entirely foreign to him. He thought of his mother who had skipped meals to keep him alive, and he thought of Isabella, whose potential had been snuffed out by a system he had helped sustain. He couldn't go back and save them, but as he watched Sophia, he felt the cycle of trauma finally break. He was paying the interest on a debt he had owed the universe for 30 years, and for the first time, the balance was starting to look even. The lawyers have finalized the purchase of the North End housing project, Don Raphael, Lorenzo said, his voice coming from the front seat. We're ready to begin the renovations on Monday, and the community garden in the East Ward is ready for the first planting. Raphael nodded, his eyes never leaving the playground. Good. Make sure the irrigation is top tier. I don't want those plants struggling for air like everything else in this city. And Lorenzo. Yes, boss. Send a gift to Sister Margaret, something for the teachers. They've been the front line for too long. Give them a reason to stay. Already done, sir. We've established a faculty endowment that triples their previous salaries. Most of them thought it was a prank until the first checks cleared. Raphael leaned back, the leather of the seat cool against his back. He reached into the center console and touched the folded, empty brown paper bag one last time. It was the most valuable asset he had ever owned, the catalyst for a revolution of the spirit. He realized that the little girl hadn't just given him a lunch, she had given him a mirror. She had shown him that beneath the charcoal suits and the gold signet rings, there was still a boy who believed in the possibility of grace. The sun began to dip lower, casting long, elegant shadows across the schoolyard. Raphael watched as the children began to head home, their laughter a melodic soundtrack to his redemption. He saw Sophia's mother waiting at the gate, her face no longer etched with the brittle exhaustion of survival, but softened by the security of a future she could finally see. They walked away together, hand in hand, and Raphael felt a final, lingering knot in his chest untie. He was at peace with the shadows because he was no longer defined by them. He was the man who had bought a school, but he was also the man who had been saved by a sandwich. Let's go, Marco, Raphael said softly. We have work to do. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving the Alvarez Center behind, Raphael didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew that the light he had kindled would keep burning long after he was gone. He was a different kind of boss, ruling a different kind of empire, one built on the sturdy, unbreakable foundation of a child's mercy. The King of Shadows had finally stepped into the sun, and the city of Oakhaven would never be the same again. He had spent a lifetime taking, but in the end, it was the act of giving that had made him truly powerful. The debt was paid, the hunger was gone, and as the car merged into the evening traffic, Don Raphael Morty smiled, a man who had finally discovered that the greatest payoff of all was the chance to start over. The story of the Mafia boss and the little girl became a legend in the South District, a whispered tale of a monster who became a guardian because a child was brave enough to see the man inside. And every year, on the anniversary of the day the school didn't close, a single brown paper bag was left on the steps of the Alvarez Center, a silent tribute to the moment that changed everything. Raphael watched from the shadows, a sentinel of the new world he had built, finally understanding that his greatest hit wasn't a life taken, but a life given back. He was at peace, and for a man like Raphael Morty, that was the ultimate victory.